Welcome all to UNOG Library and to this UNRISD Seminar, Reinventing Social Contracts, Feminists, Rights and Power, which is co-organized by UNRISD and the UNOG Library and which can be followed on Twitter at UNRISD. Why this seminar? This is part of UNRISD's activities to contribute to the Beijing Plus 20 process, together with a side event at the 59th meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women in New York. And another contribution is a series of online think pieces called Let's Talk About Women's Rights 20 Years After the Beijing Platform for Action, which will bring together leading feminist thinkers from around the world to discuss achievements on women's rights and gender equality, identify the challenges of implementing the Platform for Action, and consider ways of moving forward. We launched the series on March 2nd, so visit UNRISD's webpage to read and comment on these. The UNRISD Gender and Development Research Program is at the moment doing research on women's employment in rural areas, in particular as a result of the emergence of non-traditional agriculture exports, on violence against women in violent urban settings, and on the care economy, following a tradition of work on these issues. And finally, the ways we also are doing research on the ways in which laws and policies for gender equality are passed, focusing on, and implemented, I should say, and focusing on how women's rights advocates get their voices heard, which connects nicely with today's seminar. So our key speaker and also the editor of this book, The Remaking of Social Contracts, Feminists in a Fierce, Hard New World, co-edited with Marina Durano. Gita Sen is going to be our speaker first. Gita is Professor of Global Health and Population at the Harvard School of Public Health and until recently Professor of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, India. Gita is a highly respected scholar, a powerful advocate, and a skilled negotiator. She is a member of the Executive Committee of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, a network of women scholars and activists from the South. So without further ado, Gita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patricia, and thank you for giving us this really lovely space for this afternoon. I want to thank UNRISD. I'm always very happy to be back at any UNRISD event. I want to start off by just saying a little bit about the antecedents of this book. The book was published last year. It came out a few months ago and was published by Z Press. I want to sort of tell you a little bit about the background of where and how we came to produce this book, because like most of the of Dawn's publications, it's part of a collective process, and it comes out of a collective process. And in the case of this book, it was a very long collective process, which went on for years and years and years and years, till some people said, this book ever happening? Well, finally, it did. And I'll say a little bit about why that process took so long as well. Some of you, at least, may know and hopefully remember the original Dawn book, if you were born at that time. The first Dawn book, which was called Development Crises and Alternative Visions, was Third World Women's Perspectives, at the time when we still used to call it the Third World. was produced in time for the third World Women's Conference in Nairobi in 1984. The original, in a sense, it's important, and I thought I would just say a little bit about where this book takes off from where we were with that book. I might just say that, quite to the great surprise of all of us who were involved in producing that first book, it took off like wildfire. And there was something about its main messages that I think exactly hit the sweet spot in terms of what was in a lot of people's thinkings and heads at that time. If I might just, for those of you who haven't read that and don't know it, some of its messages, 1984 and 85 were at the height of the debates around equality and development, gender equality and development. And it was at the height of lots of discussions about gender equality. And this was the book, and Dawn itself as an organization came in to say, how do we sort of really place the discussions around gender equality in the context of development? And that if we don't do that, gender equality in itself doesn't make sense to women like us. That's why the Third World Women's Perspectives, because it's impossible for us to think about gender equality except in the context of development. So there were a number of elements of that first book talked about. We posed in many of the events surrounding before and after the publication of the book, a simple question that, in a sense, captures the crux of the challenge that we were putting forward. We said, what is the point of having a larger piece of a poisoned pie? Unless the pie is worth having, who wants a bigger piece of it? So meaning by that unless development itself is right, how can you talk about gender equality in the context of a development that in its larger dimensions is flawed and has problems? So in a sense, and that is really the core message that caught with people, because it said you cannot talk about one except in the context of a development that is fair, that is just, that is, in fact, makes it possible for everybody to exercise their rights. The book was also important because it, in fact, put forward the linkages, the interlinkages among many multiple streams of things that people were talking about at that time. Whether it was agriculture, whether it was the debt crisis and macroeconomics. Remember, 1984 is right in the middle of the period of very hard structural adjustment. And the critiques of structural adjustment programs and their implications for human development generally, but specifically for women and gender equality, was very much part of the debates and discussions at that time. So the book very much talked about the interlinkages among all of these issues: the debt crisis, the food crisis, the fuel crisis, all of which were at the top of the global agenda at that time, and said all of these have implications for gender equality, and the reverse, that these are linkages that work in both directions. The book was also very important, I think, because it pulled together, from the perspective of women of the South, the importance of the local-global connections. And this was crucial because, in fact, even in the South, there were many who said, who cares about this global stuff? What difference does it make to the life of a poor rural woman in a village in some, in some remote part of one of our countries. And the book tried to argue that, in fact, it does make a difference. That as the world, and we were early, I think, in our recognition of the great importance of globalization, and what globalization would come to mean, to say that it's impossible, you cannot be a frog in a well. That you really do need to recognize that these connections are unavoidable and that they will impinge on people's lives, whether you look at them or not. So we better start looking at them. And of course, even though in its initial starting, Dawn was not only women from the South. There were women from both South and North who were involved in the initial phase of the setting up of Dawn. It has become, of course, and then defined itself as being the voice of women from the South, explicitly having something to say, both by way, not just by way of experiences, not just by way of being the box in the report, with the picture of the woman who is, lugging fuel or water from wherever, but being the source of analysis, and therefore sort of entering into that. We were not at that time yet speaking the language of human rights. This was well before human rights. This was before the 1993 Vienna Conference on Human Rights. So the language of that period was not yet the language of human rights, even though a lot of its content was. We certainly were not talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights. That was at least a good 7-8 years later. We were not talking particularly about political ecology or climate change, because those were not issues at that time either. But despite that, I think many of the things that we were talking about, as I said, the food, fuel, and debt crises, if we look back, we can see the antecedents of those discussions today right back to that time. Now, in the period since, and of course we were not talking about financialization, we were talking about the debt crisis, but no one was talking about the great importance that the financialization of the global economy would come to have in terms of every element of the world that we live in, and certainly every element of policy space and policy possibilities for gender equality and for development more generally. Now, as we all know, the 1990s, the conferences of the 1990s, and Valeria, would you give me a 5-minute warning? The conferences of the 1990s, from that period of the 1980s, were set off a decade or more of great optimism. It was incredible optimism, because the 1980s were really hard structural adjustment, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, a real sort of feeling of retrenchment. And the 1990s seemed to go in the other direction. It was a period of great optimism. It was a period, because of the UN conferences, from UNCED to Vienna to Cairo to Beijing to Habitat and on, a period, social development in Copenhagen. There was a whole series of them which seemed to open up possibilities for thinking about development and gender equality in very different and much more progressive ways than the 1980s seemed to allow. But this great optimism was at the same time married to much greater complexity in on many fronts, including in the political economy of the world. Because the hard structural economy of economic policies, the hard structural adjustment of macroeconomic policies of the 1980s were in a sense much easier for people to understand than the much softer structural adjustment of the 1990s, which seemed to smooth down many of the problems of the 1980s on the surface, which didn't talk such a hard language of fiscal discipline, and which instead said we need to have more public-private partnerships, we need to bring in, and be more cognizant of human development and so on. So in a sense, a much more complex critique was needed in order to take this on and say, okay, what does this really mean in terms of policies, in terms of programs, and in terms of people's lives, women's lives on the ground. It was also a period where a number of the dilemmas that we now face today in what we now call the fierce new world also began to show themselves. One, and I'll just highlight a few of these quickly. One is, as I said, we began seeing the depth and breadth of the impact of the financialization of the global economy. And it became clear that the global economic system was not just going through a little blip in what was in a larger forward march of the welfare state. It wasn't just some little downturn in that we were looking at, but it was in fact a full whole-scale restructuring. And a restructuring that would affect was affecting both North and South, and would in fact be of the order of something that perhaps we had seen at the turn of between the 19th and the 20th century, with the rise of the big monopolies in global production and large corporations and so on. It was of a different order. It was a difference in kind. It wasn't just a difference of magnitude. It wasn't a small difference. Qualitative differences that demanded and continue to demand many more and more profound responses than we had assumed at the time, when we assumed that you needed to deal with the debt crisis and we would be okay. We could, continue with the developmental state. Climate change. Clearly, the collapse of the Kyoto Protocol, the rise of technological solutions, many of which are like, some crazy Strangelovian dream come true. The thought that you can put little aluminum umbrellas up in space to reflect off the sun's rays and deal with climate change. Now that sounds like a joke, and I'm saying it tongue-in-cheek, but in fact, that's one of the kinds of solutions that's being proposed. So the whole complexity of what common but differentiated responsibility means in global environmental negotiations. And is it a way to bring justice to the world, or is it a way to allow the rich in the South to get away with polluting as much as the rich in the North have done? So, a pretty complex, I think, question. Sexual and reproductive health and rights. In 1994 and 95, we didn't see what has since emerged as a major South-North fault line on this question. In fact, because right from the beginning, and I don't have the time to go into that detail, the Southern voices were very present in saying that this is part of our agenda, because women's bodily autonomy and integrity are absolutely closely connected to sexuality and reproduction, and the rights that inhere in relation to sexuality and reproduction. And this is not some kind of northern agenda being imposed on the South. But as we know, those fault lines have become deeper and more challenging. And they've also become interlinked in something that we in Dawn call the challenge of economic justice versus gender justice. So the fault line keeps breaking every time along that same groove. And we keep having to fight harder and harder to say, no, this is part of a feminist agenda that includes both North and South. At the same time, we have a challenge. As much as Southern governments may push towards a lowest common denominator when push comes to shove and be willing to give up some Southern governments, equally the North is not terribly helpful in terms of not being willing to give 1 millimeter on the economic issues to do with trade or investment or debt, but we'll keep pushing the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda. And this puts women sort of not in a sweet spot at all. It puts us in a very difficult spot of having to say a plague on both your houses. We need both kinds of justice. And of course, in terms of social movements and the restructuring of the state, the backlash against feminism, against women's rights, against human rights more generally, as is taking place in a number of places. So for us, in Dawn, this was the fierce world that we began seeing in the 1990s. And the reason it took the book so long to come out is that we've been analyzing it for quite some time, and it keeps changing. It has been changing, but now we finally said we've got to put this out no matter what. So let me then just get on to the book. And the book got produced, as I said, through a series of debates, through all kinds of papers, through meetings, through all sorts of things of the kind that, if you're interested, I can talk about later. But a couple of the things that were very important in the way that we produced this book is that we made sure that there were young people involved in the debates and discussions around the book. And we also, as you will see from the authors in the book, there were men involved. And in fact, for Dawn, it's the first time in the introductory overview we say feminists, men and women. And that this book is a product, that it is is a result of feminists, both men and women, coming together. And of course, we can have a discussion about that as well, because we know that there continues to be challenges around that. Social contracts. Why the terminology of social contracts? And this was probably one of those things about which we had some of the biggest methodological and conceptual discussions. Because, of course, social contracts is antediluvian language. And it's language that's been critiqued by feminists as being patriarchal, as being voluntarist, as being absolutely hierarchical and not terribly helpful. And yet we felt that for what we wanted, the critiques of Pateman, and there have been many people, many critiques, including from a feminist perspective. Why did we use the language of social contracts and the remaking of social contracts? So I'd just like to read, actually, for you a couple of pages, less than that, to tell you why, because it says it quicker and more efficiently. So definitions of the term social contract from the 17th century on have entered political science textbooks, as we know, and have generated criticism. We actually agree with much of this critique. Nonetheless, we use it here to capture the recognition that social processes move in fits and starts, with turmoil and transformation being interspersed by short or long periods of stability, even stasis, when there is only slow or no change at all. Our usage is thus far removed from a notion of free and equal persons creating a society based upon rules to which everyone agrees, which is, of course, the original social contract concept. Rather, it is embedded in the political economy of power and inequality at multiple levels and in varied forms. A social contract is a collective agreement for us that is built on and imbued with power. It may be imposed from above, fought over from below, and always holds the potential for change. But its fluidity is also interspersed with stability. Periods of stability in social contracts, local or global, are periods when our collective understanding of what is and what ought to be are stable and roughly in synchrony with each other, and when power structures and associated institutions are relatively steady. In such times, the main challenges to power remain within the boundaries of the system. Common normative understandings, as reflected in beliefs, social and political practices, and behaviors, reinforce the existing social order in different spheres, economic, political, etc. Of course, there's no such thing as perfect stability. Internal contradictions lead to continuous pressures for change. Neither do the different spheres work synchronously. Thus, for instance, the demand for gender justice from women's movements may be far ahead of emerging changes in the political system. There is often not a single social contract in existence, but multiple ones in different spheres that may or may not mesh smoothly with each other. Nevertheless, as we argue in the book, the difference between periods of stable social contracts and periods of instability and transformation is not just of degree, but of kind. What marks the difference, and this is important, is the breaking down of accustomed norms and beliefs as people's lived realities conflict more and more with these familiar practices to the point where there is a widespread sense that the contract is simply not working any longer. And all one has to do is to ask anybody in Greece if they think that the social contract works at this point, and they will absolutely tell you no. And they will, but if you were to ask the same people, did you think it was working 20 years ago? They'll tell you, well, it had lots of problems, blah, 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 but yes. And that's what we're trying to capture in a sense, that there is a difference between these and that we should pay attention to what the fracturing of social contracts does in terms of both the instability it creates, but also the possibility of innovation, of newness, of different things coming in. So in the book, we actually, in the different parts of the book, refer to basically two such fracturings in the recent past in the global scene. So we talk about three periods, one being the period roughly between 1945, the end of the Second World War, and 1980. The second being between 1980 and 2008, and then the third being, of course, in 2008, for the obvious reason of the financial crisis, and 2008 onwards. And we talk about a fracturing of social contracts that happened roughly around those lines. We also do have quite a bit of reflection on the role of social movements and the rise of human rights, and what is the promise and the reality of human rights for gender equality and for our common understandings. And there's a few things that, in fact, in the overview to the book that we actually conceptually speak about. One of the things is to say that we all know that the 1990s were the period when any number of new social movements came onto the scene in a major way. I'm not saying they started in that period, but they flourished in that period in a major way, whether it is, of course, the women's movement, young people, disability, LGBT, I mean, you name it, there's a whole range of movements that you see beginning to assert their presence. For us in Dawn, we said that it's very important that we look at these not as silos, but as a lens. That for us, the lens of gender, that gender and gender equality is a lens, even more importantly than it is an identity. And that is why we're, of course, able to say we can have feminist men. You don't need to be a woman in order to be for women's rights. That, in fact, it's a lens through which you look at the world. Of course, and much more than it is a calculus of identity. Now, I'm saying that, and we can just talk about it, because obviously it's not as simple as that. There is identity greatly connected with it. And then we talk as well about Dawn's approach to feminism, if we view gender equality in this way. How's my time doing? You're being very... Okay, I'm doing badly. I must be talking quickly. Okay, so let me then just read, I have time to read a little bit about how we think about feminism. From the beginning, Dawn's approach to feminism has been based not on a calculus of identity alone, but on the recognition that women's human rights are lost or gained in the midst of the interplay between the personal and the structural environment. For women as women, the politics of personal relations, of the body, of sex and reproduction matter greatly. The household and family relations are a critical site of gender power expressed in multiple dimensions. At the same time, women are workers juggling double and triple burdens under increasingly harsh conditions, are members of communities struggling for land and livelihoods, are agents in societies undergoing cultural transformations, are actors in economies shaped by globalization and militarism, and are parts of production systems that are unmindful of ecological limits. So an approach to feminism that cuts across and is inclusive of these distinct yet interconnected spheres is what we stand for, but it's clearly one that requires much, much more conceptual clarity than we felt. And obviously we think that we felt existed, and that we hope that this book helps towards. In the overview, we also talk about the three approaches to women's human rights that you find present in today's policy and program discussions, and everything including the post-2015 development agenda. One is the standard sort of women's roles approach. So women as X, so women as mothers, and women as workers, and women as informal sector workers. So one is an approach that is essentially focused on roles. The second is an approach that, the difference being between, my tongue's running ahead of me. The second is an approach that is based on gender power, but essentially as an interpersonal relationship. So going beyond the question of is the woman a mother or is the woman, to say, so what are the power relations within the family in which those roles are located. But the third one, and which is the one that we've been trying to put forward in Dawn, is that even gender power, it's not to say the others don't matter, but going beyond roles and interpersonal power, is that gender power interfaces with multiple other systems of power, and that you can only talk about gender power. And this is very different, I believe, because at the moment what we have is a lot of people talking at the level of the second one, but finding it very hard to move to the third. So you can talk a great deal. So at that point it then becomes essentially gender relations within the household, maybe within the community. And of course, there's a great deal of purchase that can be got from that discussion, but it's not enough. It doesn't take us far enough. So I'm almost finished. Let me therefore just read for you one last set of things, and let me give some examples, perhaps, of what I mean by that, if I can find the page. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. For example, when women workers are harassed sexually by bosses in workplaces which are essentially flexible, non-unionized, and give to workers very few rights in the workplace, which are essentially part of the precariat that Guy Standing speaks about. When a woman worker is being harassed there, or when transsexual workers are fired because of their gender identity, is this an abuse of their sexual rights or of their right to dignity as workers? Clearly, both factors are at work. It's not just one or the other. So you cannot talk about what is happening to women workers in the workplace without talking about what's happening to the workplace itself. Another example that we give is international trade. When you have the incorporation of TRIPS plus clauses on intellectual property in bilateral and regional trade agreements, going far beyond what the WTO ever agreed to in the Doha round, affecting the availability of cheap generic medicine. That reduced availability of generic medicines, of course, affects patients with life-threatening illnesses such as HIV or cancers and so on. But as medicines become more expensive and difficult to access, gender power kicks in to affect who will get access and how. In addition to being affected as patients, women and girls are also affected as healthcare producers and providers because they are usually the primary healthcare givers in the home. So can you then just talk about the fact that women are caregivers in the home without talking about what is happening in terms of TRIPS plus and the global round? And we have a number of other examples like this that we give from drawing from conflict, drawing from of course, unpaid work, etc. So let me just read you my last little bit, and then we're done. Where am I? Here. So our argument has important methodological implications for how this book is written. First, understanding the drivers of gender relations requires delving beneath gender roles and their effects on underlying power relations that govern the daily realities of people's lives. Gender power relations intersect with class, race, ethnicity, caste, and other markers of socioeconomic inequality to create a complex lived reality. Second, forces of political economy, such as globalization, military conflict, and ecology, are a significant influence on the environment for power relations of gender and others, thereby giving them shape. But there are important ways in which gender power itself affects the dynamics of globalization, conflict, or ecology, and these must be acknowledged and uncovered. Third, each of these sets of power relations has its own relative autonomy and must be analyzed as such, along with the analysis of their interfaces. So to put it sharply, gender power may not directly influence interest rates or the money supply. It'd be hard to figure out how it might do that. You might not find that. And hence, one cannot attempt to add women and stir to analyze every issue. One must nonetheless always ask the question whether it does or not, number one. For instance, it's necessary to understand international trade in itself, without trying to force-fit gender into every aspect of the analysis or to cherry-pick only the gender-focused bits. However, it's equally important to have an analysis of women as producers and consumers and of how gender power may not only be a consequence but a cause. The result can be a more fruitful and open dialogue and exchange between women's movements and other social movements to which women themselves often belong. Let me stop with that.
Thank you, Gita. Thank you, Gita. We are rapidly turning to Roberto Bissio's presentation. He is on Skype and listening, and he is going to be part also of our question and answers session afterwards. Roberto is Executive Director of the Instituto del Tercer Mundo, Third World Institute, a non-profit research and advocacy organization based in Uruguay. He coordinates the Secretariat of Social Watch, an international network of citizen organizations from around the world that report every year on how governments and international organizations implement their commitments on poverty eradication and gender equity. We go to that presentation.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity of joining you in this debate, more than debate, in the celebration of the launching of this really fundamental book, The Remaking of Social Contracts. Feminists have taught me that the context is all important, where we speak from is all important. So as I cannot be there with you in Geneva, I am addressing the meeting from Montevideo. And the Montevideo summer, after Carnival, and where 3 days ago a new elected legislator has taken their office, and for the first time we have in our national parliament a transgender senator. Quite novelty for this country. And it doesn't come out of the blue. The outgoing legislator was the one that legalized abortion, established egalitarian marriage as a right, formalized the work and recognized the social security rights of sexual workers and domestic workers, and actually oversaw that this formalization actually took place, and everybody is recognized by the social security system, and among other things legalized marijuana and the whole process from production to consumption. So I would say that changes can and actually do happen, and we have come a long way since back in 1909, Maria Abella, the first Uruguayan feminist, said that women should be owners of their bodies, something that is still a revolutionary platform here and in many parts of the world. At that time, when that was formulated as an aspiration, my great-grandmother was given birth and raising 15 children, 11 of which reached adulthood. 8 of them were women. And those brave women took the decision to follow Maria Abella, whom they probably never read, and take control over their own bodies. None of them had more than 3 children. Most had 2 or 1. It's a fundamental change in just one generation, and one that, while this was happening in my own family, was generalized across the whole of society. By 1920, the demographic transition in Uruguay was basically accomplished, and the average number of children per woman was 2.5. A couple of years ago, we received in our institute a graduate student that was coming from abroad to study the first 2 decades of the 20th century, feminism in those first 2 decades. So she went to the archives, parliamentary debates, the press, the manifestos of the different parties from left to right, from religious to anti-clerical. And she found an interesting philosophy and discourse of what was then called compensatory feminism. The idea being that since women had such a bad situation in society, it was not enough for them to have equal rights. They should have more rights to compensate. That's where the compensatory feminism comes about. Out of that philosophy, two laws basically persisted. One, which the divorce law, which granted women the right to divorce without having to state why. They just went to a judge and said, I want to divorce, and the judge had to concede the divorce after a period of wait and reflection of 6 months without asking why. And something that men, a right that men did not have. Men had to build their divorce case. This has changed. Now everybody can divorce. The second was the law of the chair that basically said that working places where women were at work had to have chairs so that women could sit while and rest at moments when that was intended for department stores. So if they were not with a client, they should be able and have the right to sit, something that a right that men did not have. But the point is that in none of the written and registered historical debate of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, while the demographic transitioning was happening, the word abortion does not appear once in all that documentation. The men that were the owners of the written discourse and parliamentary discourse and the press and so on were talking different things from what the women were talking among themselves, and which only later on oral history could rescue. Why I am bringing this here? Because in a way, I think it is relevant to what is happening today and to the discourse and the reflections of today. We are living 100 years after those times. Again, a moment of what Gita Sen calls in her article confusion, contradiction, and crisis. And the book is full of the descriptions of why that is happening and the different aspects of that confusion, contradiction, and crisis. Actually, if you look at the index of the book, it shocks at first reading the variety of subjects. If we were to tell any editor, I want a book that deals with religion, that deals with land grabs, that deals with the financial crisis, that deals with homophobia, and with climate change, and with war and land grabs, it wouldn't make much sense. Are you talking about 10 different books? The sense is made by the underline under the title Feminist in a Fierce New World. It's the feminist perspective that goes through the analysis of all those issues, which are the issues of the contemporary debate, but puts them under a new light. And I quote here what Gita says about it. Few analysts of the ongoing global economic crisis after 2008 invoke gender systems in their analysis, despite the fact that gender power determines who is affected, how they are affected, and how they cope, resist, or organize for change. It is becoming almost a habits, including among many women groups and many of us that work in trying to shape the discourse and the agenda, to just look at these issues and introduce gender in them by looking at how women are victimized. And usual discourse will say that war has women and children as victims, that climate change will affect and victimize women and children, that the financial crisis affects women and children different, and women as victims is the common thread of that discourse. Of course, it is not that this is untrue, but what this book does is to add complexity and to add a dimension of depth to the analysis that actually rescues women's agency. I was listening yesterday to the debate at the United Nations around the declaration that is going to be issued by the heads of state in September, that will be the preamble to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that will shape the new development agenda, which in a way is to say, as the MDGs were what we were talking about during the last 15 years, the new development agenda will shape the discourse to come. Gender is present in all of the interventions, but it is usually present from the aspect of vulnerability. Women and children as vulnerable, as victims, as those that should not be left behind. It is time for that perspective to change, and this is, I think, the main message of this book. And actually, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that the governments have agreed to, there is a lot on it that changes the development paradigm, including the paradigm of women as victims. Not only because the goal specifically on gender includes sexual and reproductive health and rights with a language that is the most advanced that we are seeing coming out of UN negotiations over the last years, but also because inequalities are being addressed and incorporated into the agenda. And those are not inequalities of income or inequalities of wealth, as those recent analyses of Thomas Piketty emphasizes, but inequalities are approached in multi-dimensional ways. But also the goals interlink, and you have a goal in agriculture that departs from the paradigm that genetically modified organism and high intense fertilizers agriculture is the solution for hunger in the world, relating to a neo-Malthusian notion of hunger as a result of lack of food instead of as a result of lack of power and the means to access food. Agriculture, I was saying, is seen as fundamental in the new paradigm, based on small and scale agriculture, based on family and organic agriculture, in a complete change of the way it was seen in the development discourse before. And that is among the approved Sustainable Development Goals. Consumption and production patterns, something that directly addresses developed countries, the model of development that they have been following, and how that impacts over the planet is also explicitly there, even though it is weak in the implementation part. Taken all together, this new paradigm opens up the possibility of overcoming the gender thoughts as just one of vulnerability and therefore compensation for that, into one where women are the agents and the decision makers over their own destiny. And in that regard, I want to quote Peggy Anthropos when she says, towards the final paragraph of the book, we need a concept of leadership that goes beyond the formal definition of leadership to include women at every level, and one that understands leadership as facilitating rather than directing change. This is our agenda for the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Roberto. And I rapidly give the floor to Patricia Schulz. Patricia is a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. She co-chaired the Swiss Conference on Gender Equality delegates and represented Switzerland in numerous international meetings, and she is a member of UNRISD board since 2011. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a lawyer by training, and I did a lot of practical work. I did some theoretical work as well, and I received this book as a real gift. So thank you very much, and I'm glad you took so much time, because that's how I got to be into the CEDAW committee and get invited here. I think the book is really amazing in my reading of it, as I saw it, because it touches upon so many issues, and that's exactly what our committee is doing. And I'm going to talk about the book through my lenses as a CEDAW member. We monitor the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This convention has 16 articles. The 16 articles cover some civil and political rights, like the right to take part in elections, to be in political and public life. It covers economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to education or to health. And there we are. We review reports from the 188 countries that have ratified this convention. What do we see? Many threats, many of which the book clearly explains, with militarization, and we see that in different contexts. We see the consequences of armed trade, for instance, in Colombia and Mexico, due to the war on drugs. But then in the context of civil ethnic strife, like in the DRC or the Central African Republic. We see the consequences of fundamentalism in the two forms, at least, that the book addresses: neoliberal on the one hand and religious extremism on the other. The first one, we see countries where the budget for health, for economy, for education, has been reduced, where privatization has been pushed of the health system, of the delivery of sanitation or whatever, water systems, etc. We see the other form of fundamentalism, religious extremism, for instance, in the hardening of rules on access of women to public spaces. We see that in certain countries where Islam is the only or the main religion, and where women have been expelled in some cases from public spaces that they used to be able to join. They have been forced to dress codes, and that is new in certain countries, or else it is the fight in other countries to try and gain new rights for women in a system where the approach to the sexes, the relationship to the sexes, is the first one that Gita explained, which is the idea of complementarity, with actually very different roles and no equality in the sense of what the CEDAW Convention addresses. Another of the points that the book addresses, and which is extremely important for us, is the intersectionality of different systems of power. And we see that through the anti-discrimination path. And what do you do with that? You have sometimes, you very often have silo mentality. So you have a woman who is discriminated against, and she's at the same time, well, she's a woman first, and she may belong to any kind of other groups, an ascription, as an indigenous woman, a minority woman from another kind of minority, whichever minority you may want to choose. She may also be somebody who has a kind of handicap. So if she wants to defend her rights to non-discrimination, how must she proceed? And there we have those silos within the national legal orders. Very often you have different legal ways to address gender discrimination or discrimination based on race or discrimination based on another criteria. And you will find that up to the level of the various human rights committees of the UN. And we get situations of women who really don't know what would be the best path, the best legal path to defend their rights. Thank you. So that was for intersectionality. Now, we deal with a lot of economic issues, and we deal with land grabs of two different types, actually. We deal with those that you mention in the book, mostly by countries or corporations, grabbing land that used to be collective land and is very often the land of minorities in a country. And these dispossession of land generally take place with the agreement of the government of the country. We see another form of land grabbing, and that is what happens to widows in certain systems. A woman may have toiled all her life on a piece of land. If the husband, or when the husband dies, the land is going to be grabbed by the family of the deceased husband, and the woman is left with nothing and is even chased away. So those are economic issues that have very strong links to legal orders, legal systems that are also shown in the book. Another aspect that we deal with permanently is violence against women, and here I thank Ricardo very much for his remarks on women being shown only as victims and women being shown as agents, the way he advocated. And that's what we try to convey also in our work with the state parties that come to the committee. I'd like to address also the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights. This is a huge debate, and we see here, as in many other issues actually, progress and backlash, depending on the country, and sometimes you have the impression that you live in parallel worlds, because in some countries it is so obvious that women will have access to safe contraception, safe abortion, efficient methods of contraception, modern safe abortion, because abortion is legal and is performed under good medical conditions. And in other countries, we deal with governments that defend very staunchly that abortion is an abomination and that they will never, not ever, remove the prohibition of abortion from their criminal codes. So this is what we deal with, and we also are faced more and more, and this is an evolution that is worrying us very much, window dressing equality. That is, countries that have been very clever, actually, have taken up the recommendations that the committee has addressed to them, have revised their laws. They have on the paper all the sort of legal and practical institutions that we recommend them to have for gender equality, but in practice you don't see progress. And this is something that we don't know how to address actually right now. It's a brand new phenomenon for us. We've had 2 or 3 countries where we see that happening. And so we have to work on that. We are also confronted with another issue that's more for the rich countries of gender neutrality. It's a sort of development, like some of the Nordic countries now are going back from affirmative action, which is clearly for women, to language of gender neutrality, and it's far more tricky to try and locate discriminations under this language. So I'll finish by answering the question that is posed in one of the contributions, which was, is it worth it for feminists to invest their time and efforts into the UN system? My answer to that is a resounding yes, as far as the treaty bodies are concerned. We work very hard with non-governmental NGO, non-governmental organizations, national and some international ones. It is a fantastic enrichment of our work and of what we hear from the state parties to have the view of civil society. And I think that when NGOs come and contribute to the work of these treaty bodies, they also get back part, at least, of their investment in good recommendations addressed to their governments, and with that they can go and do advocacy work. And we all know that you need a lot of justifications to push through ideas that should be self-evident but which are still not, and that's gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you.